Everyone agrees on what happened to Dexter Morgan. He took a bullet from his own son, survived it, and went to New York to start over. Case closed. But the fans who watch this show frame by frame think almost none of it means what it looks like. In this video, we go through the most insane Dexter Resurrection theories. Section 1. The man who never woke up. 10 weeks is a long time to lie still. That is how long Dexter Morgan spent in a coma after his son put a bullet through his chest in the snow outside Iron Lake, and when he finally opened his eyes in a small clinic run by the Seneca Nation, the show handed him a second life without much of a fight. The bullet missed whatever it needed to miss. The police never came. The woman who found him bleeding in the woods decided, somewhere off-screen, to keep her mouth shut. Everything lined up in his favor at once, and that is exactly the part a certain group of viewers refuses to accept at face value. The theory is simple to state, and very hard to shake once it settles in. Dexter never actually woke up. The bullet did what a bullet to the chest usually does, and every single thing that followed, the trip to New York, the son working at a hotel, the billionaire with a room full of murder souvenirs, all of it is happening inside a brain that is slowly running out of oxygen on a table in upstate New York. The people who hold this view are not being difficult for the sake of it. They are pointing at the way the first episode is built, and the way that episode chooses to spend its opening minutes. Before Dexter opens his eyes, the show puts him in a room with the dead. Arthur Mitchell arrives first, the man who took Rita away and cracked Harrison's childhood in half before it started, and he talks to Dexter about religion and about sons who kill their fathers. He tells Dexter that the road to coming back runs straight through hell. Then Miguel Prado shows up, standing in a graveyard, using headstones the way a teacher uses a chalkboard, walking Dexter through the list of ordinary people who died because Dexter kept trying to pass for normal. Harry appears, steady as always, pushing his son toward the boy he abandoned. And at the very end, James Dokes walks in, the one man who spotted the monster years before anyone else did, and tells Dexter there is still something worth saving in him. Taken as a normal television scene, that sequence is a nostalgia parade. Taken as evidence, it looks like something else entirely. Every one of those men is dead. Every one of them died with Dexter's hands somewhere near the cause, and the last thing any of them do is give him permission to keep going. A mind under that much stress will build the exact story it needs to hear, and the story Dexter needed to hear was that his life had a purpose he had not finished yet. The people who believe Dexter is still under point to what happens the moment he opens his eyes, because the world outside the hospital room starts behaving like a wish rather than a place. Angela Bishop, the chief of police who had already worked out that Jim Lindsay was Dexter Morgan, who had already contacted Miami about him, simply steps out of the story. She does not arrest him. She does not testify. She hands him an envelope with a photograph of herself and her daughter tucked inside, and a short line written on the back saying the two of them are square. In her version of events, told to the department and to everyone else, she is the one who pulled the trigger. A police chief in a small town takes a shooting onto her own record to protect a serial killer she had spent an entire season trying to expose. Then Angel Batista arrives, and the same softness shows up again. Batista had been told directly by Angela that his old friend might be the Bay Harbor butcher. He flew north carrying that suspicion. And when he walks into the room where Dexter is lying half-broken and completely defenseless, he opens his arms and hugs him. He explains that the death certificate he signed years ago has been undone, that Dexter is a legal person again, and he does it with a warmth that sits strangely on top of everything he supposedly believes. The suspicion is still in there somewhere, and the season eventually lets it out, but the first meeting plays like a reunion instead of an interrogation. For anyone tracking the coma theory, that scene is the strongest card in the deck. Batista is the only living man from the old Miami crew who ever loved Dexter without conditions, and the version of Batista who greets him in that hospital room is the version Dexter would build if he were designing the reunion himself. Forgiveness first, questions later, and a piece of paper that erases his death on the way out the door. The theory has a second layer that runs underneath the first, and it comes from the way this franchise has always used hallucinations. Dexter has spent 19 years talking to people who are not there, and the show has trained its audience across 2 decades to accept that a large share of what he sees is manufactured by him. Once a viewer accepts that the passenger seat of his car can be occupied by somebody who died years ago, it takes very little extra work to wonder whether the road, the car, and the city at the end of it might be manufactured too. The gap between a hallucinated person and a hallucinated world is a question of scale rather than a question of kind, and this show crossed that line a long time ago. Even the title of the series gets pulled into the argument. Resurrection is a word with a very specific weight attached to it, and Arthur Mitchell, the most religious character the franchise ever produced, is the one who says it out loud inside the coma. He tells Dexter that hell comes first. The people who hold this theory read the whole New York run as the hell part, a place where Dexter is handed everything he ever wanted and then watches it get taken apart piece by piece. He gets his son back. He gets a friend who understands what he is. He gets a room full of people who share his condition and treat it as normal. And by the end of it, his son is compromised, his friend is dead on a concrete floor, and every one of those people is either dead or running. There is a smaller and slightly gentler version of this idea that circulates alongside the full coma reading, and it argues that Dexter is awake, but that specific pieces of the season are not real. Under that version, the coma damaged something, and the figures he sees are no longer only his own voice wearing a familiar face. They are getting harder to separate from the living. The moment that gets cited most often arrives at the very end of the season, in a locked room underneath a party, when the person standing at Dexter's shoulder turns out to be somebody who has never held that position before. Whatever else that swap means, it happens at the exact moment Dexter is at his lowest, and it reads to some viewers as a mind that has stopped filing things correctly. The counter-argument is not complicated. The show goes out of its way to explain the survival in physical terms: the bullet's path, the cold, the time it took for help to arrive. Angela's decision has a motive attached to it, since she has a daughter and a career and a town, and turning Dexter in would have dragged all of it into a case she could not control. The renewed death certificate is a piece of paperwork that the story needs in order to function. And a coma reveal would be the third time this franchise pulled a trick ending, after a lumberjack in the fog and a bullet in the chest, which is a well the writers have already been criticized for going back to. None of that has slowed the theory down. It survives because it explains the thing that bothers people most, which is how neatly a story that ended with a definitive death managed to reopen itself. The man who ran the show said plainly, back in 2022, that Dexter was dead, that leaving it open would have been dishonest to the audience, and that there was no question about it being the finale. 3 years later, the same man was writing the premiere of a series about Dexter waking up. Viewers noticed. Some of them decided the only honest way to square those two statements was to assume the second one is not really happening. What makes the theory stick is that the show has never once said it is wrong. There is no scene where a doctor confirms the timeline in a way that would rule it out, no outside witness who verifies events from a perspective Dexter could not have imagined. Every important moment of the season passes through him. The narration belongs to him. The camera stays close to him. And in a story built entirely around one man's interior voice, there is no clean way to prove that voice is describing something that actually took place. There is one more piece of the puzzle that gets brought up whenever this argument comes around, and it involves the prequel series that ran the year before. In Dexter, Original Sin, the whole story is framed as memory, with the older Dexter narrating events from his early 20s, while a younger actor plays them out. Fans who track the timeline notice that the near-death experience in New Blood is what supposedly shook those memories loose in the first place, letting Dexter recall his beginnings the way they actually happened, rather than the way he had rearranged them over the years. That framing puts a strange amount of weight on the moment of dying. A story that already treats one near death as the doorway to a flood of memory has an easy time making a second near death the doorway to something even less reliable. Look at how the season treats the people Dexter meets after he arrives in New York, and the pattern gets harder to ignore. He falls into conversation with a rideshare driver named Blessing Kamara, a man with a family and a steady moral center, who takes an immediate liking to him, asks nothing of him, and helps him hunt without ever suspecting what he is. He finds a group of killers who accept him instantly and treat his condition as a shared trait rather than a sickness. He finds a billionaire who admires him. He finds a son who forgives him for the thing that should have ended their relationship forever, and who eventually chooses to help him rather than turn him in. A man lying unconscious with a hole in his chest, mourning a family he destroyed, would build a world that looks a great deal like that one. The season does push back on the idea in places, and the pushback matters. Detective Claudette Wallace circles Dexter for most of the run, and she is good at her job, sharp enough that she keeps arriving at the right questions from the wrong angle. If the whole thing were a comforting fantasy, a character built to trap him serves no purpose. Batista's death is also difficult to fit inside a wish, since it takes the one relationship Dexter cared about most and destroys it in the ugliest way available, with his friend bleeding out in front of him while still believing Dexter is responsible for everything. Fantasies do not usually work that hard to hurt the person having them. The believers have an answer ready for that too, and it goes back to what Arthur said at the very beginning: hell first, then resurrection. Under that reading, the pain functions as the entire structure of the theory, rather than an argument against it, a man punishing himself in the only language his mind understands, before allowing himself permission to come back. Whether the show ever confirms any of it is another matter, and most people arguing about it do not expect confirmation. The theory survives on shape rather than proof, and the shape fits well enough that thousands of viewers have quietly filed the whole New York season under something that may not have happened at all. The two halves of the fandom land in different places on this. The people who accept the survival at face value tend to be the ones who wanted the character back and were happy to pay a small price in plausibility to get him. The people who built the coma theory tend to be the ones who thought New Blood ended correctly and who have never forgiven the reversal. The theory, for that group, is less a prediction than a way of keeping the ending they preferred intact while still watching the show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The coma question rests on things nobody can prove either way. But there is a much smaller and much stranger argument going on underneath it, one that never asks whether Dexter is dreaming at all. It asks something far more specific about the shape of the body lying in that clinic bed, and about which side of his chest that bullet actually passed through. Section 2. The bullet, the body, and the heart, on the wrong side. Before a single frame of the new series existed, the fandom had already spent 3 years trying to solve a medical problem. A rifle round went into Dexter Morgan's chest, at close range in the middle of a frozen field. He told his son he had done well, and he stopped moving. The man who wrote that scene told the press afterward that there were 3 words worth remembering, and those words were that Dexter is dead. Then a stage at San Diego Comic-Con announced a series about him coming back, and every Dexter forum on the internet turned into a group of amateur doctors. The strangest of the survival explanations arrived early and refused to die. A Reddit user floated the idea that Dexter has dextrocardia, a rare condition where the heart sits on the right side of the chest instead of the left. Under that theory, the shot Harrison lined up was perfectly placed for an ordinary person and perfectly wrong for this one, missing the organ it was aimed at by the width of a body that was built backwards from the start. The theory picked up traction for a reason that has nothing to do with anatomy. The name of the condition contains his name. Dexter and dextrocardia sit right next to each other on the page, and a franchise that named its lead character after a Latin word for right and gave him an alias borrowed from the author of the original novels has a long history of hiding jokes inside names. The show never went anywhere near it. When the explanation finally came, it was ordinary in the way most of these explanations end up being, a matter of angles and cold weather and somebody arriving in time. But the dextrocardia idea survived the debunking anyway, partly because it is fun, and partly because it solves a second problem that the official version leaves open. If Dexter's heart is not where a shooter would expect it to be, then Harrison's shot was a real attempt at killing him rather than a moment of hesitation, and the entire relationship between them in the new series changes shape. That question, whether Harrison meant it, sits at the center of the second big survival theory. There is a group of viewers who look at the Iron Lake scene and see a young man who deliberately aimed away from the kill. The argument rests on details in the shot itself. Harrison had been taught by Dexter, had handled rifles all season, and had proven himself steady enough with one that his father made a point of it. He fired once, from very close range, at a man who was standing still and asking to be shot. Under this reading, Harrison delivered a wound that looked fatal, took the escape Dexter offered him, and drove away without checking, because the only way he could survive what his father had asked of him was to never confirm the outcome. The show has never endorsed that idea, and there is a strong case against it. Harrison spends the early part of the new series carrying flashes of the moment and behaving like a young man who believes he committed murder. He passed his high school equivalency, took a job at a hotel in New York, built a life that looked ordinary from the outside, and underneath it, he was coming apart. That is not the behavior of someone who thinks he pulled a trick shot. But the theory keeps circulating because it makes the reunion easier to accept, and because it hands Harrison a piece of innocence the story otherwise takes away from him. The third theory in this cluster is the one about Angela Bishop, and it is the one that gets the most serious treatment from people who actually think about how the show works. Angela had every reason to end Dexter. She had put the case together herself, she had contacted Miami, she had watched him kill a man she cared about, and she had a daughter who had been in danger because of him. Every incentive she had pointed one direction, and she went the other way, which is the kind of decision that makes people start looking for a reason nobody has said out loud. One reading of that is practical. Turning Dexter in would have meant explaining Iron Lake, which would have meant explaining Kurt Caldwell, the missing women, her own failures as chief, and her daughter's involvement in all of it. A trial would have dragged everything she was trying to protect into a courtroom for years. Silence was cheaper. The other reading is darker, and it argues that Angela did not let Dexter go so much as she stored him somewhere. She has leverage now that nobody else has. She can produce him at any moment, and the note she sent makes it clear she considers the debt settled only for the moment. There is a whole branch of theory built on the idea that Angela eventually comes back, either as a witness for whichever detective finally builds the case, or as a target once Dexter decides that the only living person with a complete file on him is a liability. She is one of a very small group of people still walking around who know exactly what he is, and this franchise has not historically been kind to that group. Then there is Batista, and the theory about what he was actually doing in that hospital room. The story eventually reveals that he restored the paperwork for a reason that had nothing to do with affection. A dead man cannot be investigated, cannot be charged, and cannot be put on a witness list. Bringing Dexter back to legal life was the opening move of a case, and Batista made it with his arms still around the suspect. That detail turned into a theory of its own about how long Batista had been building toward it. Some viewers argue that the suspicion did not start with Angela's phone call at all, that Batista had been sitting on quiet doubts since the Bay Harbor butcher case closed, since LaGuerta died, since Dokes took the fall for a body count that never matched his behavior. Under that version, everything Batista did in New York was the end of a decade-long private investigation rather than the beginning of a new one. He followed a truck, he tracked a buyer, he found Harrison, he worked out that the boy had sold his father's vehicle, and from there he worked out that the father was breathing. That is not the work of a man who arrived confused. The counterpoint is that Batista wanted to be wrong. He kept giving Dexter openings to explain himself, kept looking for the version of the story where his friend was still his friend, and the last conversation the two of them have is Batista refusing an explanation he no longer had the strength to believe. He died telling Dexter exactly what he thought of him, and the show made a point of not letting him take the comfort of the truth with him. The survival cluster has one more theory attached to it, and it is the least popular but the hardest to fully rule out. It suggests that Dexter had a hand in his own rescue, that the man who spent decades planning around every possible outcome did not walk into that field without a version of events where he lived. Supporters point to how carefully he set the whole confrontation up, offering Harrison the rifle, positioning himself, choosing the words that would make his son able to pull the trigger. They argue that a man who has spent his life controlling how bodies are found would have thought about how his own would be found. The obvious problem with the theory is that it requires Dexter to gamble his life on his son's aim, and the story frames that moment as the one time he stopped calculating entirely. But this is a character who lied about his own death once before, walked into a hurricane, and turned up in Oregon with a beard and a new name, so the fandom has learned not to assume he ever stops planning. The most telling detail is that the show seems aware of the problem. The first episode spends its opening minutes with Dexter's dead adversaries instead of with a doctor explaining trajectories, and it lets Arthur Mitchell deliver a line about hell and resurrection rather than letting a surgeon deliver a line about entry wounds. The writers chose the mythology over the medicine. Anyone hunting for a technical answer had to build one themselves, and thousands of people did. The rifle itself has become a favorite piece of evidence for people who think the whole confrontation was staged by the man who lost it. Dexter gave Harrison that weapon as a Christmas present, and the showrunner has openly described it as a gun placed on the wall in an early scene so it could be fired in a later one. Anyone who plants a weapon that deliberately in a story has thought about where it ends up. The theory holds that Dexter, who has never in his life handed somebody a tool without knowing what it would be used for, chose the gun, chose the range, and chose the moment, and that a man doing all three has already run the outcome in his head more than once. There is a smaller argument about who found him, and it matters more than it sounds. Somebody located a man lying in the snow in a wooded area outside a small town, in winter, at night, quickly enough that he was still alive when they got there. The season leaves that almost entirely alone, and the people who dislike the survival explanation keep pointing at the gap. A rescue that fast is either extraordinary luck or somebody knowing where to look, and the only person who knew where to look had just told the entire department that she was the one who pulled the trigger. The 10 weeks themselves became a second gap for people to fill. During that window, Harrison packed up a life, sold his father's truck to a man in Iron Lake, and moved to New York City, and the show later uses that truck as the thread Batista pulls to find him. Every step of that is the behavior of someone who thinks he has left a body behind. But some viewers noticed how quickly Harrison rebuilt, how quickly he found work, and passed his equivalency exam and started making friends, and argued that the speed of it points to a young man who was not carrying the specific weight of murder so much as the weight of a decision. Others read it the opposite way, as a boy running as fast as he could from a memory that would catch him the moment he stopped moving. There is also a quiet theory about Joey Quinn that gained traction after the finale, because Quinn turns out to be more woven into events than a passing cameo would suggest. He is still at Miami Metro. He has been promoted, and a call from him is what leads Dexter to the phone that saves his life at the very end of the season. For most of the original run, Quinn was the one detective who came closest to catching Dexter and then chose to let it go, and he survived doing so. Some fans read his continued presence as a setup rather than a nostalgia beat, arguing that a man who once buried his own suspicions will not be able to bury them a second time when a colleague turns up dead in a billionaire's basement. All of these arguments run on the same fuel. The audience was told a story had ended, then told it had not, and the bridge between those two statements was built quickly and quietly. People who love this show do not object to being surprised. They object to being handed a door that opens too easily, and every theory in this cluster is an attempt to put a lock back on it. One last idea deserves a place, mostly because of how many people arrived at it independently. It argues that the show does not owe anybody a mechanism at all, and that the survival works precisely because it is thin. Every previous ending in this franchise tried to be airtight and got picked apart anyway, and the writers appear to have concluded that spending an hour explaining a bullet's path would only invite more arguments about the path. So they gave the audience the shortest possible version, put the emotional weight on the coma instead, and moved the story to New York before anyone could set up a chalkboard. Viewers who accept that reading tend to point out that this is exactly how the original series handled its own biggest leaps, from a police blood analyst maintaining a full second life to an entire department missing it for 8 years. The show has always asked for one piece of belief up front and then earned everything after it, and the bullet is simply the newest version of that request. There is one more theory in the survival pile that almost nobody takes seriously and that refuses to disappear anyway. It argues that the 10-week figure was chosen rather than calculated. 10 weeks is long enough to be a real coma and short enough that Harrison could not have built a life anywhere permanent, which means the number exists to put father and son in the same city with the same amount of damage between them. Viewers who like this reading treat the entire medical question as decoration. The show needed Dexter unconscious for exactly as long as it took Harrison to become findable, and it picked a number that did the job. Attached to that is a quieter argument about what the coma cost him beyond the time. He came out of it weaker, slower, and older, and the season keeps putting him in situations where his body lets him down, in ways it never used to. He struggles with people he would once have handled easily. He gets caught. He ends up locked in a room he cannot get out of without help from a teenager. For a character whose entire method depends on being physically in control of every encounter, that is a permanent change rather than a temporary injury, and a number of fans read the whole first season as the show quietly retiring the version of Dexter who could do this alone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Explaining how Dexter survived is one problem. Explaining who is waiting for him in New York is a much bigger one, because the season spent 10 episodes whispering about a killer who never once appeared on screen, and the name that finally turned up in a folder sent an entire fandom into a spiral that has not stopped since. Section 3. The name in the folder. For 10 episodes, the New York Ripper existed as an absence. He killed 22 people. He used a long rod fitted with a hooked blade that most viewers recognized as a tool for lifting manhole covers, and then he stopped. Years passed. The case went cold and stayed cold, and the only thing that kept it alive was a detective named Claudette Wallace, who had worked it when it was fresh and never let it go, and a habit the killer developed after he retired. He calls the families. He calls the people who survived him and the people who lost someone, and he keeps calling, decades later, because the killing stopped, but the pleasure did not. That is an unsettling piece of writing, and the show fed it to the audience in small doses across the whole season. He is mentioned. He is discussed. His weapon turns up in a billionaire's trophy collection. He is never seen, and a mystery constructed that carefully, in a fandom this active, produced exactly what anyone would expect. Every character in the show got accused. The most popular suspect for a long stretch was Blessing Kamara, the rideshare driver who befriends Dexter and never asks the wrong question. The reasoning was structural rather than evidential. He is warm, he is helpful, he is written as the ordinary decent man in a season full of monsters, and this franchise has a long record of putting its worst people behind its friendliest faces. He also drives for a living in a city where the Ripper hunted, and he attached himself to Dexter with a speed that some viewers found suspicious rather than charming. The second popular candidate was Melvin Oliva, Wallace's partner. That theory ran on the oldest trick in crime fiction, the idea that the detective closest to the case is the one who has been steering it away from himself for years. Oliva is younger than the case, which was a problem, but supporters argued that the show was hiding the timeline deliberately and that a partner would explain why every promising lead went quiet. Then there was the group who suspected the people at the top. Leon Prater owned the Ripper's hooked blade. He kept it as a trophy in a room full of trophies, which means he either bought it from someone who had it or he got it from the man himself, and one of those explanations is much simpler than the other. Charlie drew heavy support for the same reason, since she was the one person moving through that world with enough freedom to have met him, handled him, and kept him quiet. A smaller group went after Gareth Pike, the Gemini killer, on the grounds that a man who turned out to be two men had already proven he could hide an entire second identity. And a handful of viewers went after Claudette Wallace herself, arguing that the detective who never solved a case in 20 years might have had a reason not to. Every one of those theories died in the same 90 seconds. Locked inside Prater's vault, Dexter goes through the files, and one of them carries a name. Don Frampt, the New York Ripper. That was it. No face, no scene, no entrance, no confrontation. A name printed on a folder belonging to a dead man, and then Dexter deliberately leaves it behind for Wallace to find, walking out with a different stack of files under his arm. The reaction split immediately. Some viewers found the restraint elegant, a season that refused to hand its biggest mystery a cheap payoff. A much larger group found it flat. The Ripper had been built up for 10 hours and resolved with a piece of stationery, and the name attached to him belonged to nobody anyone had ever met. Fans had spent months building elaborate cases about characters they cared about, and the answer turned out to be a stranger. Which is precisely when the theories got wilder, because a name with no face attached is an invitation. Within days, the dominant idea was that Don Frampt is an alias, and that the man behind it is somebody the franchise already knows. Two candidates rose above the rest. The first was Jonah Mitchell, the son of the Trinity Killer. The appeal of that theory is obvious the moment it is said out loud. Dexter spent new blood in Resurrection trying to keep his son from becoming what he is. Arthur Mitchell never tried, and his son eventually killed his own mother and sister. Two fathers, two sons, one who was pulled back from the edge and one who was pushed over it. Putting Jonah in New York as a retired killer who torments survivors by phone would let the show tell that story directly, and it would give Harrison a reason to face the child of the man who murdered his mother. It would also give the writers an excuse to keep John Lithgow in the building, since a Jonah with a dark passenger would presumably talk to a version of his father in his head, the same way Dexter talks to Harry. The second candidate was Cody Bennett, Rita's son, who was a small boy when his mother was found in a bathtub, and who has not been seen or mentioned in over a decade. That theory sits on a colder logic. Cody lost his mother to a serial killer, was raised by a grandmother, and grew up without the man who had been standing in as his father. A story where that child came out the other side as a monster would be the ugliest possible verdict on Dexter's life, and this franchise has never been shy about ugly verdicts. Both theories got knocked over by a casting announcement rather than by a scene. In the spring of 2026, the trades reported that Brian Cox had joined the second season as Don Frampt. Cox is decades older than either Jonah or Cody would be, which ended both theories on arithmetic alone. The character description that came with the announcement matched what the first season had already established. A killer who terrorized the city years ago, no longer active, who found a new way to live inside his own reputation by continuing to torment the people who survived him. That announcement created its own problem, and it is a problem the fandom has not entirely forgiven. The identity of the season's biggest mystery was delivered by a press release. Viewers who had spent a year theorizing found out who the Ripper was from an entertainment website rather than from an episode. Some of them argued that the whole thing was deliberate rather than accidental, that a show which had already teased its villain in advance for the first time in its history had decided the fun was in watching the confrontation rather than in guessing the name. Others refused to accept even that. A theory took hold that the name in the folder is still not the whole answer, and it drew strength from a small detail in the reporting itself. Different outlets printed the name slightly differently, with variations in the spelling turning up across trade stories and recaps. To most people, that is a transcription error. To a fandom that has spent 20 years hunting for hidden meanings in names, it looked like evidence that the name is a construction rather than a birth certificate. If a man has been hiding for 2 decades while calling his victims' families for entertainment, he is not doing it under the name printed on his mail. Before Cox was announced, the guessing had reached strange places. Fans were floating Nicolas Cage. Fans were floating Matthew McConaughey. The reasoning was not entirely unhinged, since the first season had put Peter Dinklage, Uma Thurman, Neil Patrick Harris, Kristen Ritter, Eric Stonestreet, and David Dastmalchian into the same 10 episodes, and a show with that kind of casting budget could plausibly land anyone. What those guesses really showed is how large the Ripper had grown inside the audience's head. He had become the biggest character in the show without appearing in it. The man in charge eventually acknowledged the whole phenomenon. Speaking about the second season, showrunner Clyde Phillips said the internet had gone completely wild over the name, mentioned the theories about Cody and about Jonah Mitchell by name, and admitted that the reaction had pushed the writers to think harder about the character than they might have otherwise. He confirmed the storyline continues and that the man will be in the second season. He did not confirm that the name on the folder is the truth. That is the state of it. A killer with a name, a face now attached to the name, and an entire community that still suspects the name is a costume. The official synopsis for the second season describes Dexter caught between two killers, one of them notorious, and the other doing something to New York that nobody saw coming, and the fandom has already started arguing about which of those two the Ripper actually is. A cluster of smaller theories grew up around that folder in the months after the finale, and several of them are more interesting than the identity guessing ever was. The first concerns how the hooked blade ended up in Prater's collection at all. Prater did not buy trophies from auction houses. He gathered killers, hosted them, listened to them, and kept detailed files on every person who ever sat at his table. Files that doubled as blackmail. The blade being in that room means the Ripper was in that room, and it means the two of them had an arrangement. If that is true, then a great deal of what happened during the first season took place under the eye of a man who has now watched Dexter operate for months without ever revealing himself. That leads directly into the theory that the Ripper already knows exactly who Dexter is. He had access to Prater's world. He would have known about the guest calling himself Red, the newcomer who arrived from nowhere and left a trail of missing killers behind him. Under this reading, the reason the Ripper never appeared on screen has nothing to do with the writers holding him back. He was watching. And the second season does not begin with a hunt so much as with a man discovering he has been the prey for a year. The other side of that same coin is the theory about why Dexter left the file behind. On the surface, it plays as a kindness. Wallace has burned her life on this case, and Dexter hands her the answer without her ever knowing where it came from. Plenty of viewers read it that way. Others notice that the same act does something else entirely. It gives the Neeped a target that is not Dexter. It puts the department's most dangerous detective on a decades-old cold case instead of on the man who has been killing across her city all season. And it does all of that while looking generous. A man who has spent his adult life arranging what the police find has a long history of leaving things behind on purpose. There is even a theory that Frampt is already dead and that the file is the last piece of a case rather than the first piece of a hunt. Supporters argued that a killer who stopped 20 years ago and switched to telephone calls sounds like a man whose body is failing him, and that the second season might spend its time on the survivors and the wreckage rather than on a chase. The casting of a lead actor in a series' regular role made that theory hard to sustain, but it has not disappeared entirely, and a version of it now suggests that the man on the phone and the man who did the killing are two different people. The second season complicated all of it by adding more killers to the board. Alongside the Ripper, the show cast a second antagonist, known as the Five-Borough Killer, described as a man who calls in threats against ordinary people and then carries them out, and a third figure known as the Sleepy-Eyed Stranger. Fans immediately started connecting them. One theory holds that the newer killer is a student of the older one, taking the phone calls that made the Ripper famous and turning them into a method rather than a hobby. Another holds that the Ripper's return to activity is a response to being copied, a retired man dragged back into the work by watching somebody else wear his reputation badly. The casting of a horror veteran, best known for playing a masked killer in a long-running film series, in a role the production refused to describe at all, added another layer that nobody has been able to crack. What ties this whole cluster together is a shift in how the show is telling its story. For 19 years, this franchise introduced its villain and then unmasked him within the same season. This is the first time the audience was handed the shape of a monster in advance and then made to wait a full year for the face. That single structural change is what turned a background cold case into the most argued about character in the franchise, and it happened without the man ever saying a word on screen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Ripper theories mostly died when a casting announcement landed. One of them survived, and it did not survive by guessing an actor. It survived by asking a much colder question about the woman who has spent her entire career chasing him, and about whose blood might be running through her. Section 4. The detective with the wrong last name. Claudette Wallace spends the first season being underestimated by almost everyone, including a large part of the audience. She is patient in a way television detectives usually are not. She does not shout, she does not chase, and she does not make the big dramatic accusation in the middle of a squad room. She asks small questions, writes things down, and comes back later. And she has one case that has followed her for her entire adult life, a case she was on when it was fresh, and that has never let go of her since. The show gives her a small habit that fans latched onto immediately. She dances. There is a Bee Gees track that functions as her theme across the season, a song about staying alive, and she puts it on and moves to it in moments when the work is going badly. In the finale, that song is playing right before she finally learns the name that has been missing from her case for 2 decades. Viewers who watch this franchise closely do not treat song choices as decoration. A detective chasing a killer to a song about survival, in a show where every investigator who ever got close to Dexter Morgan ended up in the ground, reads to a lot of people as either a promise or a warning. The theory that made the biggest noise about her arrived long after the first season ended, and it started with photographs. During filming for the second season, set images began circulating, and 2 separate readers of a long-running Dexter fan site arrived independently at the same conclusion and sent it in. The New York Ripper, they argued, is related to Claudette Wallace by blood, either her uncle or, in the version that got the most attention, her father. The appeal is easy to understand. It solves the one thing the show has never explained about her, which is why this case in particular. New York detectives work hundreds of cases. Cold ones get boxed and shelved and forgotten because the job demands it. Wallace never shelved this one. She kept it alive through a career, through partners, through decades of nothing, and she stayed on it long past the point where the department stopped caring. Obsession like that usually has a private engine underneath it, and the theory supplies one. It also mirrors the story the whole franchise is built on, only turned sideways. This show has always been about what fathers hand down to their children. Harry taught Dexter a code that turned a boy into a machine. Arthur Mitchell handed his son a life that ended with Jonah killing his own family. Dexter handed Harrison a rifle and a philosophy, and then asked him to use both. A detective who discovers she has been hunting her own father for 20 years, and who spent her life in law enforcement without ever understanding why, would be the same story told from the other side of the badge. There are good reasons to doubt it. The writers of this series have said repeatedly, across interviews, that not everything inside the world of Dexter needs to connect to everything else, and that they are wary of tying every new character back to an old one. The theory also carries an unfortunate resemblance to the Jonah Mitchell guessing that dominated the previous summer, where a large section of the fandom convinced itself the Ripper had to be a legacy character and turned out to be completely wrong. 2 rounds of the same instinct, arriving at the same kind of answer, does not make the second round more likely. There is also a practical problem. If Wallace has been chasing a relative, then somebody in her family recognized the name Don Frampt the moment it turned up, and a detective who is willing to work a case for 20 years is not the kind of person who misses that. The theory requires her to be either blind or complicit, and both of those cost her the thing that makes her interesting. The larger theories about Wallace do not need her to be related to anybody. They are about what role she is being built to fill, and the fandom has a very specific fear about that. This franchise has a pattern with the people who investigate Dexter Morgan. James Dokes worked out what he was and died in an explosion in a cabin with the crime attached to his name. Maria LaGuerta rebuilt the Bay Harbor butcher case from the ground up, got it right, and was shot dead in a shipping container. Angel Batista spent 19 years as the friend who never suspected, finally suspected, followed the trail all the way to a billionaire's mansion, and was shot 4 times in the back while Dexter watched. 3 investigators, 3 correct conclusions, 3 bodies. Wallace is now the 4th, and she is currently the sharpest of them. She has physical evidence, a department behind her, a partner, and a case she is emotionally incapable of dropping. The theory that she becomes the next name on that list is closer to a pattern recognition exercise than a prediction, and a lot of viewers are already braced for it. The counter-argument is that the show cannot afford to run the same play again. Batista's death was the highest-rated episode in the history of the entire franchise, and it also cost the series its last living link to the original Miami cast. Killing the next investigator would turn a pattern into a formula, and the writers spent the whole first season working hard to avoid formula. Under that reading, Wallace survives specifically because she is supposed to be the one who breaks the streak, and the tension of the second season comes from her getting closer than anyone ever has, while staying alive to keep going. A more interesting version of the theory suggests she already knows more than she is letting on. She met Dexter. She interviewed him. She was told by Angel Batista, in person, that the man calling himself a New York rideshare driver was the Bay Harbor Butcher, and she did not act on it fast enough, and then Batista turned up dead in a vault. Guilt is a strong motive, and the theory holds that Wallace has spent the gap between seasons quietly rebuilding everything Batista told her, and checking it against a body count she now realizes she has been misreading for a year. There is a specific piece of evidence sitting in her hands that supports this. When the Nipdeed swept Prater's vault, they did not just find a body and a murder weapon. They found the files. Prater kept dossiers on everybody, and one of those files concerned Mia LaPierre, the killer who was arrested and then died in her cell, in what the department recorded as a suicide. Dexter knew that was not a suicide. The audience knows it was arranged by Charlie and paid for by Prater. A detective going through those files would find the same thread, and a detective who realizes a suspect in her custody was murdered by a billionaire's staff would start pulling on everything else that billionaire touched. That is the version of the theory with the most support behind it, because it does not require any hidden family connections or secret identities. It just requires Claudette Wallace to be good at her job, which the show has already spent 10 episodes proving. There is one more wrinkle, and it is the one that makes the second season dangerous for everyone involved. Harrison Morgan is joining the police. The publicity images released ahead of the second season show him in a New York uniform, and the show has cast a new character as a training officer in the homicide unit who becomes his love interest, along with her father, the homicide captain running that unit. Harrison, who killed a man in a hotel kitchen during the first season and had the crime pinned on somebody else by his own father, is walking directly into the building where Claudette Wallace works. Fans have already drawn the line between those two dots. The theory holds that Wallace does not catch Dexter through evidence at all. She catches him through his son, by working next to a young man who is carrying something he cannot hide from a room full of detectives, and the darkest version of that theory suggests Dexter knows it, encouraged it anyway, and is prepared to do something terrible about it when the time comes. Her partner has his own set of theories attached to him, mostly built on how little the show chose to tell us. Melvin Oliva is present for almost everything Wallace does. He is competent, and the season never gives him an interior life of his own. In a series where quiet supporting characters have a habit of turning into something else, that emptiness reads to some viewers as a space being saved. One theory holds that he becomes the one who finally believes her when nobody else does. Another holds the opposite, that he is the one who talks her out of the case at the exact wrong moment, either because he is protecting his career or because somebody is paying him to. A quieter and more convincing theory about Wallace argues that the engine behind her obsession is professional rather than personal. She was there when the Ripper was active. She was a young detective on the biggest case in the city, and the man walked away from 22 bodies and then spent the next 20 years calling the families to remind them that nobody ever caught him. That goes well past a cold case sitting in a box. The man has been personally taunting her department, and by extension her, for 2 decades. Under that reading, the theory about a family connection is unnecessary, because humiliation on that scale is more than enough motive for a lifetime. The phone call she made to Miami during the first season has become its own small thread. Wallace reached out to check on Angel Batista, spoke to Joey Quinn, and came away with the impression that Batista was a man in decline, a retired detective who had never recovered from the Bay Harbor Butcher case and the murder of Maria LaGuerta. That impression is exactly what allowed her to set his warning aside. Dexter later reinforced it, painting his old friend as unstable. Fans argue that the moment Wallace realizes she was managed by both the man in Miami and the man in New York, everything she believes about the season gets rewritten. She did not fail to catch a killer. She was steered. Several people have pointed out how much of her position now depends on paperwork rather than instinct. She is holding Prater's files, and those files are not evidence in the way a court understands the word. They are a dead billionaire's private collection, gathered illegally, full of blackmail material about people who are still alive and powerful. A detective trying to build a case out of them is going to spend a season fighting her own department, her own prosecutors, and whoever else is named inside them. That is a version of the story where Wallace never gets close to Dexter at all, because the system swallows her long before she reaches him. Then there is Blessing Kamara, who nobody has stopped worrying about. He is the only person in New York who spends real time with Dexter without any suspicion attached to it, and he has a family, a job, and no idea what he is standing next to. A number of theories treat him as the bridge, the ordinary man whose testimony eventually puts a shape around the version of Dexter that the police have been chasing. Others treat him as the cost, the friend who dies because he got close, in the same way Rita died, and Deborah died, and Batista died. There is a grim version of that argument that says the show has taught its audience to recognize the pattern so well that Blessing's warmth in the first season was less like a friendship and more like a countdown. All of this leaves Claudette Wallace in a position no character in this franchise has ever occupied. She has a name, a body, a murder weapon, a set of files, a partner, a department, and a young man about to walk into her building, carrying a secret that could unravel everything. Dokes had a hunch. LaGuerta had a theory and a bloodslide. Batista had a hug and a suspicion. Wallace has a case. And a fandom that has watched 3 people die for less is not optimistic about her chances, no matter how well she dances. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Most of the Ripper theories try to guess an identity. There is one that gave up on the identity completely, argued that the man behind the phone calls was never meant to be a villain at all, and reframed the entire season as a warning aimed at Dexter himself. Section 5. The killer who stopped there is a theory about the New York Ripper that does not care who he is. It appeared on Reddit shortly after the finale, spread quickly, and it argues something that no amount of casting news can disprove. The Ripper was never built to be a villain. He was built to be a mirror, and the thing he reflects is what Dexter Morgan turns into if he lives long enough. The theory rests on a comparison rather than a clue, and the comparison is with Dexter himself. Dexter Morgan has tried to stop 3 separate times. He walked away from Miami into a hurricane and reappeared as a lumberjack in Oregon before settling in a small New York town under a false name. He spent almost 10 years in Iron Lake with no kills at all, working in a shop, dating the chief of police, going to community dinners. And every single time, the appetite found a door. It came back through a spoiled rich kid with a rifle. It came back through a man in a basement with a room full of women. It came back through his own son. The pattern of this character is not that he kills. The pattern is that he cannot successfully stop, and every retirement he has ever attempted has ended with him standing over a table. The theory says the Ripper is the next stage of that. A man who actually stopped, who found something quieter to feed on, and who has spent 20 years hurting people without lifting a knife. The theory treats him as a preview rather than an obstacle. The strongest piece of evidence supporters point to is a decision Dexter makes in the finale that almost nobody expected. He is standing inside the vault with the entire collection in front of him, and he goes through it, and he takes what he wants. He takes files on Jawsplitter. He takes files on the Midnight Mangler. He takes files on the Yonkers Slayer, and he takes the file on Al Walker, the one killer from Prater's circle who got away from him. And then he reaches the folder with the Ripper's name on it, the most famous unsolved murderer in the city, the exact kind of trophy that this man has spent his entire life collecting, and he leaves it on the shelf for the police. That is not how Dexter behaves. This is a character who hunted the ice truck killer, the Trinity killer, the Skinner, the Doomsday killer, and treated each of them as his to claim. Handing the biggest name in the room to the Nifty is a genuine break with everything the audience knows about him, and the theory reads it as recognition. He looked at the file, understood exactly what he was reading, and did not want it near him. The second piece of evidence is smaller and easier to miss. Earlier in the season, Dexter took a blood slide from Lowell Sloan, the first killer he removed from Prater's circle, slipping back into the ritual he had abandoned years earlier. At the end of the season, standing over Prater on the table, with a knife in his hand, he refuses to take one. He kills him and takes nothing. For a character whose entire psychology has been built around keeping a piece of every person he killed, choosing to walk away empty-handed is a change with weight behind it. The theory holds that Dexter, having just read about a man who could not stop collecting even after he stopped killing, decided he did not want to be that. That is where the second season's official description turns the whole thing into something more than speculation. The synopsis released with the first look images says Dexter is caught between two killers, and then adds one more line about the thing he is actually fighting. His greatest enemy, the synopsis says, is a midlife crisis. In a franchise that has spent 2 decades using words like dark passenger and code and ritual, a show describing its own antagonist as the passage of time is a significant choice. Fans who had been arguing about the symbolic reading of the Ripper treated it as close to a confirmation. The season is about aging. It is about a man in his 50s who has been doing the same thing since his 20s, looking at somebody a full generation further down the same road. There is a version of this theory that goes further and reads the phone calls as the Ripper's blood slides. Dexter's slides were never souvenirs in the ordinary sense. They were proof, evidence he kept for no audience but himself, a way of holding on to a moment long after the body was gone. A telephone call to a grieving family does exactly the same work through a different medium. It reopens the kill. It puts the killer back inside the moment. It keeps the thing alive without any risk of a new crime scene. Under that reading, the Ripper solved a problem Dexter has never solved, which is how to feed the appetite without generating bodies, and he solved it by making the appetite feed on memory. The theory has a third leg, and it involves Harrison. If the Ripper is the man Dexter becomes if he stops, and Dexter is the man Harrison becomes if he does not stop, then the second season is stacking 3 generations of the same problem on top of each other. Harrison already killed a man in a hotel kitchen. Harrison already helped his father put a billionaire on a table. Harrison is now joining the police, which is precisely the choice Harry engineered for Dexter more than 30 years earlier, and which the show has explicitly framed as history repeating. The mirror theory turns that into something worse than an echo. It turns it into a system where every generation finds a slightly different door for the same appetite, and none of them ever manage to close it. The obvious objection is that a symbolic mirror does not need a series regular playing him. When the casting announcement landed and confirmed a major actor in a recurring role for the second season, the version of this theory that argued the Ripper would remain a shadow was finished. He is going to be on screen. He is going to have scenes. He is going to be, in some form, an antagonist. Supporters adapted rather than folded, and their answer is reasonable. This franchise has never been able to keep its metaphors off stage. Arthur Mitchell was a mirror of what Dexter feared becoming, a family man with a monster underneath, and he was also the most physically dangerous villain the show ever produced. Brian Moser was a mirror of what Dexter would be without Harry's code, and he was also a man who tied Deborah to a table. The show does its symbolism with a body count. A Ripper who works as a warning about Dexter's future, while also threatening his present, fits the house style perfectly. There is a strange companion theory that runs alongside this one, and it concerns the only member of Prater's circle who walked away alive. Al Walker, the killer the group knew as Rapunzel, presented himself as a family man from Wisconsin, with a wife and 4 children, who came to New York once a year to talk shop with people like himself. He cut the ponytails from his victims and gave several of them to Prater. He described his murders as a form of self-care, a way of keeping the ugly part of his life separate from the part with school runs and birthday parties in it. Dexter listened to that and took the advice seriously for a while, which is one of the more uncomfortable things the season does. The theory that grew around Al argues that none of it was ever real. Under that reading, he never killed anybody in his life. He is a man who worked out that a billionaire would pay enormous sums for access to genuine murderers, and he manufactured the evidence to get inside the room, staging his trophies and his stories for a customer who wanted very badly to believe them. Supporters point out that Prater never verified anybody, that his entire operation ran on collecting people who claimed things, and that a room full of killers is exactly the environment where a convincing liar would be believed without question. If that theory is correct, then Dexter is now carrying a file on a man who does not meet his code, and the second season has him hunting somebody he cannot kill without breaking the only rule he has left. That fits the mirror argument neatly, because it turns the whole first season into a study of people performing an appetite rather than simply having one. Prater collected killers because he wanted to feel close to something he did not have, right up until he shot Angel Batista in the back and discovered the thing he had been shopping for was inside him after all. Lowell built rituals around tattoos. Mia built a moral framework around revenge. Gareth split himself into two people. Each of them found a way to organize the hunger into something they could live with, and the Ripper found the quietest arrangement of all. Then there is the simple, unromantic version of the mirror theory, which is about time. The man playing Dexter Morgan started this role 2 decades ago. The character has been carrying bodies, digging, lifting, running, and driving through the night since he was in his 30s. And none of that gets easier. A number of viewers think the show is building toward a very specific realization. Dexter has always assumed his story ends with capture or with death. The mirror theory raises the possibility that it ends with neither, and that the actual ending is a man who gets too old to do this and has to work out what is left of him when the work stops. Nobody expects a peaceful version of that. The prediction that comes up most often is that the second season closes with Dexter making a genuine attempt to stop, out of exhaustion or out of fear for his son, and discovering within an episode that he has no idea how. The Ripper would then be less a warning than a demonstration, a man who found the answer and made it worse. There is one more branch worth mentioning, and it is the nastiest. If the Ripper's method is calling the people left behind, then the second season has an obvious target list waiting for him. Dexter has people now in a way he did not for most of the first season. He has a son with a job and an address. He has a friend who drives a car for a living and talks about his family constantly. He has a woman who used to work for the man he killed. A retired murderer whose entire remaining pleasure comes from reaching the survivors by telephone, pointed at a man who has just finished building himself a small circle of living connections, is a threat that does not require a single new body to be effective. Several viewers have argued that this is the real reason the show cast a heavyweight actor for a character who supposedly stopped killing years ago. He does not need to kill anybody. He needs a phone and a list, and Dexter handed him one by finally letting people close. What makes the theory land is the detail that a lot of people missed on first watch. When Dexter leaves that file behind, the show does not treat it as a victory or a sacrifice. There is no music swell, no moment of triumph. He simply moves past it. And then he takes the yacht out past the Statue of Liberty, drops a body into the water, and delivers a monologue about accepting exactly what he is, which is a man who will keep doing this and has stopped pretending otherwise. He turned down one future and walked directly into another, and the theory argues that the folder he left on the shelf is going to come find him anyway. There is a loose end attached to all of this that almost nobody talks about. Dexter did take one slide during the first season from Lowell Sloan, and nothing in the finale suggests he got rid of it. That is a piece of physical evidence tying him to a murder, sitting somewhere in his possession, in a city where a detective is currently working through a dead billionaire's records and building a list of everybody who attended his gatherings. Lowell was on that list. The theory holds that the one time Dexter let the ritual pull him back in is the thing that eventually costs him, which would be a fitting way for a story about compulsion to end its main character. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Dexter walked out of that vault, carrying files and leaving a friend behind on the floor. The fandom has never accepted that part cleanly, and a stubborn group of viewers spent the entire gap between seasons arguing that the man bleeding in the corner was not as finished as everyone assumed. Section 6. The Friend on the Floor. Angel Batista was the last one left. Dokes died in a cabin, LaGuerta died in a shipping container, Deborah died in a hospital bed, and Batista kept going, promoted and retired, and eventually pulled north by a phone call from a police chief in a town he had never heard of. He spent the first season of the new series doing the thing he had refused to do for 19 years, which was believing that his friend was a murderer. And in the 9th episode, standing in a billionaire's private vault, he got the confirmation he had been chasing, and then a man he barely knew shot him 4 times in the back. The episode that killed him became the highest-rated installment in the entire history of the franchise, higher than the 4th season finale that most fans had treated as untouchable for 15 years. It also produced one of the ugliest moments the show has ever staged, because Dexter spends Batista's last minutes trying to convince him of a technicality. He did not kill Maria LaGuerta. He did not kill James Dokes. Both of those things are true, and Batista, bleeding out on the concrete, tells him it makes no difference, because those people are dead because of him, and now so is Batista. His final words to Dexter are a curse. He dies without the comfort of an explanation, still holding the version of events that hurts most, and Dexter has to live with that being the last conversation. A small group of viewers refused to accept it, and their argument was built on precedent rather than evidence. This is a franchise where a man took a rifle round to the chest and turned up 3 years later, working a rideshare in Queens. It is a franchise where a sergeant died in an explosion, and where the man everybody assumed was gone kept coming back. The rule those viewers were applying is an old one in television, which is that a character is not dead until the show makes it impossible to argue otherwise. The show made it impossible fairly quickly. The finale shows the body in the vault. It shows Dexter saying goodbye to his friend before he leaves. It shows the Nepede, drawn upstairs by an alarm, Dexter set off deliberately, finding Batista where he fell, alongside the weapon, with Prater's fingerprints on it. There is no ambiguity built into any of it. The survival theory faded within days. What replaced it is far more interesting and much more likely to actually happen, because this franchise has never needed a pulse to keep somebody in the story. Batista comes back, but not in the flesh. This show has always kept its dead close. Harry has been standing at Dexter's shoulder since the very first season, dispensing the code in a tone that shifts depending on what Dexter needs to hear. Brian Moser turned up after his death to argue for the version of Dexter that has no rules. Deborah took the passenger seat throughout New Blood, mocking him, hating him, refusing to let him off the hook. The interior of Dexter's head is a room where the people he has lost keep talking, and every one of those figures has represented a different piece of his own thinking, wearing a familiar face. Batista has never had that job, and the theory says he is about to get it. The reasoning is simple. Every ghost this show has ever produced comes from someone whose death Dexter caused, directly or otherwise, and whose opinion of him he cannot escape. Batista qualifies more completely than anyone in the franchise's history. He was, as much as anybody who ever lived, an actual friend. He also died believing the worst possible version of the truth, which means the version of him that lives in Dexter's head will never soften, never forgive, and never accept the technicality about LaGuerta. The actor playing Dexter has come close to confirming exactly this. Speaking about the second season, Michael C. Hall said it was reasonable to expect that Angel would still live inside Dexter's mind and heart, added that they might explore it, and pointed out that a character being dead has never stopped this show from putting them inside Dexter's interior world. Fans took that as close to an announcement. The version of the theory with the most weight behind it says Batista takes the position over entirely. During the finale, Harry loses his chair to Brian Moser for the first time in the franchise's run, and he loses it at the worst possible moment for Dexter, which leaves the seat contested for the first time in 19 years. A conscience that has spent 19 years being Dexter's father, and which just got pushed aside by his serial killer brother, could plausibly be replaced by the one man who saw him clearly and hated what he saw. A Harry who makes excuses for him, swapped for an angel who never will. The second cluster of Batista theories has nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with paperwork. Batista did not come to New York quietly. He built the whole thing himself, from a vehicle sale in a small town all the way to a hotel in Manhattan, and then made contact with the NYPD. He spoke to Claudette Wallace directly and told her what he believed. He spoke to Quinn in Miami. He had been building this for months, and men who build cases for months tend to leave things behind. The theory holds that somewhere there is a file, a recording, a set of notes, or a message that Batista left with somebody. Maybe with Quinn, who is now a lieutenant at Miami Metro. Maybe with Masuka, who is still there and who has known Dexter longer than almost anyone alive. Maybe with his sister Jamie, who once worked as Harrison's nanny and who has a personal connection to both of the Morgans. The most likely candidate is Wallace herself, who has already been told what Batista believed and who now has a dead colleague and a vault full of files to explain it with. Jamie has her own branch of theory attached to her. She lived in Dexter's home. She cared for his son. And she is now the sister of a man who died chasing him. A version of the theory suggests she comes back for the funeral and stays, either as somebody who reopens old questions or as a person Harrison has to face while carrying the knowledge of what actually happened in that vault. Masuka gets a similar treatment. He has spent the entire franchise as comic relief, and viewers who have followed him from the start point out that he is also a forensic scientist who worked every Bay Harbor butcher scene there was. A grieving Masuka, going back through evidence he processed 20 years ago, with a new reason to care, is one of the more quietly dangerous ideas anyone has proposed. Then there is the theory about the frame itself, and it might be the most practical one in the whole cluster. Dexter arranged Batista's death scene the way he arranges everything. Prater's fingerprints on the weapon, the body left where it fell, the alarm triggered on his way out so the police would find it during a gala full of officers. It is a clean story, but Prater also vanished the same night, which means the NYPD is holding a murder with a suspect who never turned up, and a suspect who never turns up is a case that stays open forever. A detective as patient as Wallace does not close a file just because the obvious answer is convenient, and there is an entire theory built around the idea that the frame Dexter constructed is what eventually points back at him. Underneath all of these is the theory about what Batista's death does to Dexter as a character, and this is the one the writers seem most likely to actually pursue. For 19 years, the code has functioned as a leash. Dexter kills people who have killed and who will kill again, and the rules exist to keep the appetite pointed somewhere he can live with. Batista was not one of those people. He was a decent man who was right about everything, and he died in front of Dexter because Dexter refused to give him up and refused to let him go. There is no version of the code that accounts for that. A large group of viewers believes the second season opens with a man who has quietly stopped believing in his own rules. The evidence they point to is in the finale itself. Prater is on the table, and he complains that none of this would have happened if Dexter had simply killed Batista when he was told to, and Dexter answers that he tries not to kill good people. He tries. That is a much weaker sentence than anything Harry ever taught him, and it is the closest this character has come to admitting that the framework is a preference rather than a law. The theory that follows from that is straightforward and grim. With Batista dead and the code softened, the thing that decides who lives is no longer a set of rules, but a question about whether somebody is a threat to Harrison. That standard has nothing to do with a code. It is a father with a knife and a reason, and the show has already demonstrated what he does when his son is at gunpoint. There is also an unresolved thread running back to Iron Lake. Batista only came north because Angela Bishop called Miami and told him what she believed. She started this. She then covered for Dexter, took a shooting onto her own record, and stepped out of the story, and the man she alerted is now dead because of the alert. A theory that has been circulating since the finale argues that Angela finds out, and that finding out is what finally breaks the arrangement she made. She could live with letting a man walk away. Living with a colleague being murdered as a direct result of her phone call is a different weight, and it hands the New York investigation a witness with a complete history and no reason left to protect anybody. A quieter version of the same idea involves the people Batista left behind in Miami. He was not a loner. He had a sister, a daughter, an ex-wife who was murdered years earlier, and a squad room full of people who worked beside him for decades. The theory holds that the second season does not need a detective to come after Dexter at all, because grief works faster than evidence. Somebody who loved Angel Batista is going to want to know exactly what he was doing in New York, why he was in a billionaire's basement, and who the friend was that he had gone up there to find. Fans have also spent a lot of time arguing about whether the show should have killed him in the first place. Batista was the last surviving member of the original Miami cast, and the only person left who remembered Dexter as a colleague rather than as a suspect. Removing him closed the door on 19 years of history in a single scene. One camp argues that closing it was the point, that the new series cannot become its own thing while dragging the old one behind it, and that the highest-rated episode in franchise history proves the decision worked. The other camp argues the show spent its most valuable remaining piece to buy a single hour of television, and that everything Batista could have done in the seasons ahead was worth more than the shock of losing him. Both camps agree on one thing, which is that the show is not finished with him. In a franchise where the dead never actually leave, a character who dies believing a lie is a chair waiting to be filled. A related theory concerns the funeral, or the lack of one. Batista died in a foreign city, inside a crime scene belonging to an ongoing investigation, and the show never showed him being buried. That absence has been read as an open door. A funeral in Miami would bring Quinn, Masuka, Jamie, and whoever else is left of that department into the same room, all of them asking why a retired detective drove north to chase a man who had been declared dead. It would also put Dexter in an impossible position, since not attending is suspicious and attending is worse. The most painful theory in the cluster suggests Dexter eventually tells Harrison the truth about it, not the version where a billionaire killed a stranger, but the version where a good man died in front of his father because his father would not surrender. A son who is training to work homicide, hearing that from the man who raised him, is the kind of scene this show has spent 19 years earning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every theory about Batista assumes Dexter is the one who has to carry the weight of it. There is a whole separate school of thought that says the audience has been watching the wrong Morgan for 2 seasons, and that the person this story actually belongs to has been quietly turning into something worse the entire time. Section 7. The Boy Who Was Born in Blood. Harrison Morgan has now killed 2 people that the audience knows about, helped subdue a third, and covered up a body in a hotel kitchen before his 20th birthday. He is also, according to the man who runs the show, never going to be killed off. Those 2 facts sitting next to each other are the foundation for one of the largest theory clusters in the fandom, and it argues something the series has been circling since the day he was born. Harrison is not Dexter's son in the way most television handles the word. He was found as a small child, sitting in a pool of his mother's blood in a bathtub, which is the exact circumstance that created his father. Laura Moser was killed with a chainsaw in a shipping container, while 2 little boys sat in the blood for days, and both of those boys grew into killers. The show has treated that as its central superstition for 20 years. Being born in blood makes a monster. Harrison was born in blood twice, once through his father's genetics, and once through Arthur Mitchell's bathtub, and a great many viewers have never believed the series is going to let him escape that. His arc across the first season of the new show does not help the optimists. He is working at a hotel in New York, keeping his head down, doing well. A guest named Ryan turns out to be a serial predator, and Harrison kills him in the kitchen. Nothing about it plays as panic or self-defense. It is a young man applying his father's logic to a stranger and then dealing with the body. Dexter arrives in New York specifically to save him from the consequences, and the way he does it is by taking a murder committed by his son and hanging it on Mia LaPierre, a killer already in the wind, so that the Niptid closes the file on somebody else. That single decision is what convinced a lot of fans that the show is running the Harry story again in a new suit. Harry Morgan looked at a child with something broken in him and, instead of getting him help, gave him a set of rules and a career in law enforcement that would keep him supplied and protected. Dexter looked at his son standing over a body and did the same thing in one night, by clearing the evidence and letting the boy go on with his life. Different method, same conclusion. The father decided the son was going to keep doing this, and quietly arranged for him to get away with it. Then the finale takes the argument and makes it explicit. Locked in a vault with no way out, Dexter calls his son, and his son walks into a gala full of police officers, dressed as a waiter, and breaks him out. When Prater catches him and puts a gun to his head, Dexter offers himself in trade and signals Harrison to use the sedative he had been given earlier. Harrison puts the needle in. The two of them then take a billionaire down together, and Dexter kills him on a table. The monologue that closes the season is where the theory finds its best evidence. Dexter talks about what Harrison has become to him, and the words he uses are not the words a father uses about a child he is protecting. He describes his son as a strategic partner, as a confidant, as a friend. He says that when his darker urges start to rise, he can lean on Harrison to feel more human and more connected, and to be reminded why he does what he does. He says he used to wish he could be different and normal, a life without the dark passenger, and then he drops the pretense and accepts what he is. A father describing his son as the thing that helps him keep killing has stopped talking about redemption and started talking about recruitment. The theory that grew out of that scene holds that the first season was never about Dexter saving Harrison from the darkness. It was about Dexter finding, for the first time in his life, someone he could be himself around, and choosing that over the boy's chance at a normal life. The second season pushes it further, and the publicity images made it official. Harrison is joining the New York Police Department. There is a new character in the cast, Fiona Mixon, a training officer in the homicide unit who becomes his love interest, and her father is the captain running that unit. Harrison Morgan, who has killed, is going to be working homicide with a girlfriend who works homicide, and a boss who runs the squad. There is no way to read that as anything other than the show restating its founding premise. Harry put Dexter inside Miami Metro, so he would have access, cover, and a supply of targets. 30 years later, Dexter's son is doing exactly the same thing in a different city, and the season's own description says Harrison continues his own pursuit of justice, while father and son face their darkest chapter. From there, the theories split into two camps, and the disagreement between them is not really about Harrison at all. It is about who this show belongs to now, and whether the man whose name is on it is still the person the story is following. The first camp says Harrison ends up being the villain. Not immediately, and not in a simple way, but eventually. The reasoning is that a young man with the appetite and none of Dexter's decades of discipline, working inside a police department, with a father who has quietly encouraged every step of it, is a bomb with a slow fuse. Supporters point out that Harrison has already demonstrated he will kill people who are not on any list, and that he did it without the elaborate ritual that keeps his father contained. Dexter needs a table, a room, plastic sheeting, and a confirmed history of murder. Harrison needed a kitchen and about 90 seconds. The second camp says Harrison is the ending. This theory takes the showrunner's promise seriously, that Harrison will not be killed off in the second season or in any season, and works backwards from it. If the son is guaranteed to survive and the franchise is guaranteed to end, then the son is the one left standing at the end of it, which means Harrison either buries his father or arrests him. He has already shot him once. The theory holds that the entire New York run is building toward a second version of the Iron Lake field, with Harrison making the same choice again, only this time understanding fully what he is doing and finishing it properly. There is a third and darker reading that combines both. Under it, Harrison inherits everything, including the code, and the last image of the franchise is a young detective in New York who has become his father exactly the way his father became Harry. That would make the whole 19-year story a closed loop, a warning that nobody in this family ever gets out, and it fits the way this show has always resolved its themes, which is bleakly. The romantic subplot has generated its own set of theories. Harrison ended the first season with a young woman named Gigi, and the second season introduces a police officer as his new interest, which suggests one relationship does not survive the transition. Several viewers have pointed out how reckless it is for a young man with a body in his history to build a life around people whose job is finding bodies, and a common prediction is that Harrison's girlfriend is the one who works it out first. She is inside the department, she is training in homicide, she has access to everything, and she has a personal reason to keep looking once something stops adding up. The most uncomfortable theory in the whole cluster asks what Dexter does when that happens. He has already killed to protect Harrison. He has already framed an innocent, or at least a differently guilty, person to protect Harrison. He told a dying praetor that he tries not to kill good people, and the word he chose was tries. A police officer standing between Dexter Morgan and his son is exactly the situation the code was never designed to handle, and the first season went out of its way to show what happens when someone decent gets in the way. Not everyone in the fandom accepts the premise underneath all of this. There is a sizable group that argues Harrison's darkness is a completely different animal from his father's, and that treating them as the same thing is the mistake the show keeps making on purpose. Dexter's condition is presented as a compulsion, something that builds like pressure and demands release on a schedule. Harrison's has always looked like rage with a trigger attached. He hurt people at school, he went after a wrestling coach, he killed a predator in a hotel. Every one of those has a cause sitting right next to it, which is what makes them look like trauma rather than appetite. If that reading is correct, then Harrison is treatable in a way his father never was, and the tragedy of the series is that the only adult in his life is a man with a vested interest in believing otherwise. Dexter needs Harrison to be like him. He said as much in his final monologue. A father who has spent his entire adult life alone, who finally found somebody he can be honest with, has every reason to interpret his son's anger as the family condition rather than as a wound that could still heal. Under this theory, Dexter is not protecting Harrison at all. He is recruiting a boy who might have walked away. There is a piece of the first season that supports it, and it comes from an unlikely source. Charlie confronts Harrison during the final stretch and points out, bluntly, that his father is close to a stranger to him. She is trying to shake him, and the strange thing is that she is technically correct. Harrison spent most of his life without Dexter, spent a few months with him in Iron Lake, shot him, spent 10 weeks believing he had murdered him, and then reconnected in New York. The total time these two have spent as father and son is small. What they have instead is a shared secret, and secrets bond people faster and worse than love does. There is also a bomb sitting under the relationship that the show planted early and has not detonated. Harrison does not know how his hotel killing was cleaned up. He does not know that his father took the murder of a man in a kitchen and attached it to Mia LaPierre, or that Mia was then killed in her cell by a guard paid by Prater's people. The chain runs from Harrison's hands to a woman dying alone in custody, and Harrison has no idea it exists. A very popular theory holds that the second season, or the one after it, hands him that information at the worst possible moment, most likely while he is wearing a badge. The same applies to Batista. Harrison knew Angel, however distantly, as a figure from his father's Miami life. He does not know that Batista came to New York because of him, that Batista died in a vault while Dexter watched, or that his father arranged the scene so a dead billionaire would take the blame. A young man in the homicide unit is going to run into that case eventually, because it is one of the most notable unsolved murders in the city, and it involves a retired detective from a department his father used to work for. Jack Alcott has taken a strange amount of criticism from parts of the fandom, largely because a section of the audience simply did not want a son in the story at all. That view softened considerably during the new series, mostly because the writing gave Harrison something to do beyond glowering. The theory community treats him as the most important variable in the franchise now, and for a specific structural reason. Dexter cannot be caught in a way that satisfies anyone, because being caught means a courtroom and a cell and the end of the show. Harrison can be caught, can be exposed, can be broken, and can do all of it, while his father is forced to watch and decide how far he will go to stop it. That is the version most people expect. Not a season where the police close in on Dexter Morgan, but a season where they close in on his son, and where the only man who can save him is the reason he needs saving. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Harrison is not the only person walking back into Dexter's life with unfinished business. Somebody else survived that vault, knows exactly what he is, and had every reason to disappear forever. The set photographs from the second season show her standing in the middle of Manhattan instead, and nobody can agree on why. Section 8. The woman who cleaned up after everybody, Charlotte Brown, who everyone calls Charlie, spends most of the first season being the most competent person on screen. She was special ops before she took the job. She runs Leon Prater's security, and the work involves finding serial killers across the country, verifying them, inviting them, and then making the consequences disappear. She is the reason Prater's arrangement functions at all. He provides the money and the fascination. She provides the logistics. The season shows exactly how far that goes. When Mia LaPierre is arrested, and the entire circle panics about what she might say, Charlie solves it by paying a guard, and Mia dies in her cell, in what the department records as a suicide. She kills a man named Keith herself when he becomes a problem. She threatens Dexter to his face, and is one of the very few characters in this franchise who has ever made him look outmatched in a physical situation. And underneath all of it, there is a reason she does the job, which is that her mother is dying, and Prater is paying for the treatment. That is the setup, and it turned her into the most theorized about character in the show after the Ripper. She has the skills, the access, the body count by proxy, and a private reason for all of it, which is a combination the fandom could not leave alone. The biggest of those theories, which ran for most of the season, argued that Charlie was the New York Ripper. The version that got the most traction came out of a long analysis piece and worked like this. She is ex-military, with the training to have done it. She stopped killing years ago, which fits a dormant case, and moved into recruiting other killers for a man who collects them. The phone calls that keep tormenting the survivors are not personal at all. They are outsourced, made by somebody she pays to keep the legend alive. And behind all of it sits Prater, orchestrating a citywide fear campaign for his own entertainment. It was a strong theory, and the finale killed it in about 4 seconds when the file with a man's name on it turned up in the vault. But it did something useful on the way out, because it forced viewers to look closely at Charlie and notice how much the season deliberately does not tell us. Her history before Prater is thin. Her special ops background is stated rather than shown. Whatever she did before this job is the biggest gap in the entire cast. The finale then complicated her instead of resolving her. Dexter, locked in the vault, goes through Prater's files and finds one with Charlie's name on it. It contains photographs, and those photographs link her directly to Mia's death in that cell. He tells her it exists. He offers to destroy it in exchange for letting him and Harrison walk out. She says no. That refusal is the single most argued about moment in her whole arc, because turning down that trade makes very little sense on the surface. Instead of taking the deal, she quits. She confronts Prater, tells him she is finished, and warns him that if he stops paying for her mother's treatment, she will burn everything he has. Then she takes her mother out of New York and goes home to Massachusetts. The problem is that Prater dies the same night. The money stops. The treatment stops. And that file, the one with her name and the photographs linking her to a murder inside a jail, is still sitting in a vault that the New York Police Department has now taken possession of. That is the position she is in when the second season begins, and the show has already confirmed she comes back. The actress returned, and set photographs from filming in Manhattan showed her in scenes with both Dexter and Harrison. Then the official first look images arrived, and one of them showed something nobody had predicted. Dexter and Charlie sitting at dinner together, with their hands touching. The fandom lost its mind, and the theories divided into 4 rough camps that disagree about almost everything except the fact that the photograph means something. The first camp reads it exactly as it looks, as the beginning of a relationship. There is precedent, and it is not encouraging. This is a man who has been drawn to dangerous women his entire life, Lila set fires and burned a cabin with children in it. Hannah McKay was a poisoner who killed multiple people and who Dexter loved anyway. Lumen Pierce was a survivor who killed alongside him and then walked away when the need passed. Dexter has never once managed a relationship with someone ordinary that did not end with that person dead or destroyed, and the only ones that ever felt real were with people who knew exactly what he was. Charlie qualifies completely. She knows what he is, she has seen him work, and she is not frightened of him. The second camp reads the dinner as a negotiation rather than a date. Under this theory, Charlie returns to New York for one reason, which is the file. She needs it gone, and the only person alive who knows it exists, knows what is in it, and has already offered once to destroy it, is Dexter Morgan. The hands touching represent a deal being made across a table by two people who each hold something the other needs. He wants information about Prater's operation and about the people in those files. She wants a photograph to stop existing. The third camp is the most cynical and reads the whole thing as a con. Charlie spent the first season being underestimated by everybody who met her, and she outmaneuvered nearly all of them. She got Mia killed without touching her. She managed a circle of murderers without any of them realizing she was managing them. A version of this theory holds that she has attached herself to Dexter specifically because she needs a weapon, and that whatever she is pointing him at will only become clear once he is too far into it to walk away. The fourth camp goes the other direction entirely and argues that Charlie is the closest thing to a good person the new series has produced. The evidence is thin, but real. She did everything she did for a dying mother. She refused a deal that would have saved her because taking it meant helping Prater keep Dexter in a hole to starve. She warned Harrison off rather than hurting him, and several people noticed that her appearance in the second season's images is softer and less controlled than the polished figure from the first season, which some viewers read as a character who no longer has anybody to perform for. There is a smaller theory that ties her back to the season's main threat. If the Ripper was connected to Prater's world, then Charlie is the only living person who ran that world from the inside. She would have handled the invitations, the verification, the travel, the cleanup. She may well have met him. She may well have been the one who obtained his hooked blade for the collection. A theory that has been quietly gaining ground argues that she returns to New York for a reason that has nothing to do with the file, and that somebody from that world has started calling her. The darkest theory about Charlie concerns how she ends. This show has a habit of taking the women who get closest to Dexter and using them as the cost of his existence. Rita in a bathtub, Deborah in a hospital bed, Hannah driven into exile, Lumen walking out the door. There is a prediction circulating that Charlie is being set up to be the price of the second season, and a competing prediction that she is the one who finally does what nobody else has managed, which is to see Dexter completely, decide he cannot be allowed to continue, and act on it with the training to make it stick. What makes her dangerous as a character is that she is the only person in the show's history who has all three things at once. She knows what he is, she is not afraid of him, and she is physically capable of finishing him. Dokes had the will and lost the fight. LaGuerta had the evidence and never saw it coming. Batista had the friendship and it killed him. Charlie has the file, the skills, and no illusions left about anybody, and the show has put her at a dinner table across from him with a season still to run. Part of what fuels all of this is how the invitation system worked in the first place, because Charlie built it and Charlie ran it. Prater did not stumble across serial killers. Somebody found them, confirmed they were real, approached them without getting arrested or killed in the process, and brought them to New York with enough discretion that a room full of active murderers felt safe sitting down together. That is an extraordinary job, and it means Charlie spent years developing a working knowledge of how these people think, where they hide, and what they respond to. It also means she is the reason Dexter got in. The invitation that started everything was found in the apartment of Ronald Schmidt, the rideshare killer the press had nicknamed the Dark Passenger, after Dexter killed him and took his identity. That invitation came from Charlie's operation. She vetted a man, invited him, and then a completely different man walked through the door wearing his name, and she did not catch it for weeks. For someone that careful, Missing a substitution that large is either the one mistake she made or something she allowed on purpose, and there is a whole branch of theory built on which of those it was. The version that argues she allowed it is more interesting than it sounds. Charlie spends the season managing a group of people she has every reason to despise, cleaning up murders she did not commit, for a man who turned out to be keeping a blackmail file on her the entire time. A woman in that position, looking at a newcomer, who quietly begins removing her employer's collection one at a time, might reasonably decide not to look too closely. Every killer Dexter took off the board was one less problem on her desk. There are smaller theories orbiting her that never got resolved. One holds that her mother's illness is not what it appears to be, either exaggerated or entirely constructed, built as a cover story that explains her loyalty to Prater without exposing whatever the real arrangement was. Another holds the opposite and treats it as the only honest thing in the show, the single ordinary human motive in a season full of appetites. Supporters of the second reading point out that she took her mother home at the end rather than running somewhere untraceable, which is the behavior of a daughter rather than an operative. Then there is the question of the other invitations. Prater's operation had been running for years, and the vault contained files on people who never appeared on screen. The circle Dexter joined was one gathering out of many, and the killers in it were a fraction of the names in that room. Anybody who has ever been invited knows the address, knows the format, knows Charlie's face, and now knows that the man who ran it is missing. A number of viewers expect the second season to bring one of those people back looking for answers, and Charlie is the only person alive who can tell them anything. She also knows about Harrison. She confronted him directly. She watched him move through a gala full of police officers to free his father, and she understands exactly what that boy did and what he is capable of. In a series where knowledge about the Morgans has historically been fatal to whoever holds it, she is carrying more than almost anyone. The fact that she is walking around New York with all of it, sitting across a dinner table from Dexter Morgan, with her hand near his, is either the most dangerous position in the show or the safest, and nobody in the fandom can agree on which. One detail from the finale keeps getting pulled into theories about her, and it involves how Dexter got out of that vault at all. The code that opened it was tied to the man who murdered Prater's parents, which tells the audience something about why a billionaire spent his life collecting killers and treats that obsession as a wound rather than a hobby. Charlie worked for him for years. She would have known that story, and she would have known what the code was. Which means the only reason Dexter and Harrison walked out of that building alive is that the woman who could have changed the lock chose not to, at a point when she had already decided to quit, but had not yet left the property. Fans arguing about whether Charlie is friend or threat in the second season keep returning to that gap, because a person who quietly leaves a door unlocked has said something without ever having to say it out loud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Charlie is one of the few people in Dexter's life who is actually breathing. The room he spends most of his time in is filled with people who are not, and something changed inside that room during the finale that a lot of viewers found more disturbing than anything that happened above ground. Section 9. The room inside his head. There is a second cast in this show, and none of them are alive. Harry Morgan has been standing at his son's shoulder since the first season of the original series, arriving at crime scenes and kitchens and empty apartments to remind Dexter of the rules he wrote. Brian Moser turned up after Dexter killed him, arguing for a version of his brother with no code at all, and left when Dexter refused. Deborah took the passenger seat through New Blood, furious and disgusted and relentless, saying the things her brother could not say to himself. None of these people are ghosts in the supernatural sense, and the show has never pretended otherwise. They are Dexter, split into pieces and given faces. Harry is the part of him that wants rules. Brian is the part that wants none. Deborah was the part that knew exactly what he had cost the people around him, which is why the fandom watches that room the way other audiences watch a plot, because whichever figure is doing the talking reveals which part of Dexter is currently winning. The first season of the new series opens by filling that room with strangers. During the coma, Dexter is visited by Arthur Mitchell, by Miguel Prado, and by James Dokes, alongside Harry. Every one of them is a man he destroyed, or who was destroyed because of him, and every one of them tells him a version of the same thing, which is that he has to get back to his son. The showrunner confirmed that reading directly, describing the whole sequence as Dexter's subconscious pushing him toward Harrison. Fans took something else from it as well. For the first time, the room was not restricted to family. His enemies were allowed in. Then the finale did something the franchise had never done, and a large section of the audience found it more disturbing than the murders. Locked in a vault beneath a party, with no exit and no plan, Dexter turns and finds Brian standing there in Harry's place. And Brian is not there to comfort him. He mocks the code, mocks the man who wrote it, and asks his brother why he ever believed in any of it in the first place. Harry has held that chair for 19 years. He has been wrong, he has been manipulated, he has been revealed as a flawed and selfish man who built a monster to solve his own problem, and he has never once been replaced at a moment that mattered. The theory that grew out of that scene is simple and unsettling. The part of Dexter that argues for rules has lost, and the part that argues for appetite has taken over, and the show marked the handover by changing the face in the room. Everything Dexter does afterward supports it. He kills Prater and does not take a slide. He walks out with a stack of files that function as a list rather than a memorial. He takes a yacht out past the Statue of Liberty, drops a body in the water, and delivers a monologue in which he stops apologizing for what he is. None of that belongs to a man following Harry's code. It belongs to a man who has decided the code was a story his father told him so that his father could sleep. The theories about where that goes divide sharply. One camp expects Brian to stay, becoming the primary voice of the second season, and pushing Dexter toward the version of himself that has no restrictions. Another camp expects Harry to fight his way back, because the show has never fully abandoned him, and because James Remar turned up in the footage the studio released from the start of production on the second season, which fans noticed and discussed at length. A third camp expects the chair to change hands again entirely, with the newest death in Dexter's life taking the position. Then there is Deborah, and her absence is the loudest thing about the interior room in the whole new series. She was the dominant voice through New Blood, the one who called him a monster to his face and never let up. Reports ahead of the first season indicated Jennifer Carpenter would not be returning, and she did not appear, not in the coma sequence and not afterward. That gap produced its own theories. The most common one argues that Deborah left because she stopped being useful to him. She was the voice of guilt, and guilt was the engine of New Blood, a season built around a man who had spent 10 years hiding and was being eaten alive by the things he had done. The Dexter of the new series is not being eaten alive by anything. He accepts himself by the end of the season and says so out loud. A conscience that harsh has no function inside a man who has stopped arguing with himself, so his mind stopped generating her. The darker version says the opposite, that Deborah was the last piece of him capable of shame, and that her disappearance works as the clearest evidence in the whole series that something in him is gone, rather than as a sign of health. Under that reading, the coma did not just cost him 10 weeks. It cost him the part of himself that could still be reached. A third version treats her absence as a card being held. If the franchise is building toward an ending, and if that ending involves Dexter finally facing what he is, then the person who has to deliver that verdict is his sister. Several fans expect her to return once, in the final stretch, for exactly one conversation. The second season is expanding the room in a way that supports a different theory entirely. It was confirmed that Kristen Ritter returns as Mia LaPierre, the killer known as Lady Vengeance, who died in a jail cell during the first season. She is dead, which means her appearance is either a flashback or a vision, and the second option is the one that matters. If Mia starts turning up inside Dexter's head, then the room has expanded past family and past his old enemies to include his own recent victims and the people who died because of his choices. That is a significant shift, because Mia is not a straightforward case. She had a code of her own, built out of something that happened to her, and she killed people she considered deserving. She is also the person Dexter framed for a murder his son committed, which is the reason she was arrested, which is the reason she was killed in that cell. If she starts talking to him, she will be talking about that, and there is no version of the code that makes it acceptable. The wider theory that has run for years is that the room eventually fills with everyone. Rita has never appeared as one of these figures, despite being the most consequential death in the franchise. Lila has never come back. Hannah McKay is alive somewhere in Argentina, as far as the story is concerned, along with Harrison's memories of her, and there is a persistent theory that she returns in person rather than in his head. Lumen Pierce is also alive and is one of the very small group of people who know exactly what Dexter is and chose to walk away from it rather than turn him in. Aster and Cody sit in a strange corner of all this. They were Rita's children. They lived with Dexter. They lost their mother to Arthur Mitchell and were sent away to their grandparents, and the franchise has essentially never mentioned them since. There is a long-running theory that they come back with questions, and a sharper version that argues they never believed the official story about how their mother died. A grown Aster arriving in New York with a decade of suspicion behind her is one of the more plausible unused ideas in the entire franchise. Underneath all of these is a theory about the mechanism itself, and it is the one that would change the most. It suggests the hallucinations are no longer a storytelling device at all, and that the coma damaged something real. Supporters point out that the figures are appearing more often, in more varied forms, and now include people Dexter hated rather than only people he loved. They point to the fact that Harry was displaced at the exact moment Dexter was under the most physical stress he has experienced since the shooting. And they point to the second season's own description, which puts aging at the center of the story. A man in his 50s with a head injury and an increasingly crowded interior life stops being a metaphor and starts being a medical problem. The most repeated theory of all, though, is about Harrison. It predates the new series by years, and it has never gone away. If the code passes from father to son, then so does the room. The prediction is that Harrison begins seeing someone standing at his shoulder, offering advice, keeping him safe, telling him which rules to follow. And the theory holds that when he finally turns to look, the face he sees will be his father's. Something worth noticing is how much Harry himself has changed as a presence. In the original series, he was earnest, exasperated, and largely paternal, a man arguing for restraint even when the argument was self-serving. The version standing beside Dexter in New York is sharper and considerably colder. When Dexter is working his way through Prater's circle, picking them off one at a time, Harry needles him about losing all of his friends. None of that reads as a father guiding a son. It reads as a man enjoying himself. A theory built entirely around that shift argues that Harry stopped being the code years ago and became something closer to a running commentary, a version of Dexter's own voice that has given up trying to steer and settled for watching. Under that reading, Brian taking the chair in the vault works as a formality rather than a takeover, an acknowledgement of something that had already happened, with the last honest label finally being applied to a voice that had stopped meaning what it used to. The coma visitors have generated their own smaller readings. Arthur Mitchell arrived first and set the terms, telling Dexter that hell comes before resurrection, which a lot of viewers treat as the closest thing this franchise has to a stated plan. It is the most religious statement anyone in this show has ever made about Dexter's future, delivered by the character with the strongest religious framework, and it describes a process rather than a moment. Hell, then coming back. If that line is a roadmap, then the New York seasons are the middle of it, and something is still owed. Miguel Prado's appearance was read as the practical argument. He stood in a graveyard and pointed at the people who died because Dexter tried to live like everybody else, and the graves he pointed at were the ones the audience already knew. That is the show reminding its viewer, in the first 10 minutes, that every attempt at normality this man has ever made has produced a body. Dokes drew the most discussion of the three because his message was the strangest. The one man who identified Dexter as a monster before anybody else, who spent an entire season being right and being ignored, and who died with Dexter's crimes attached to his name, tells him there is still something good in him and sends him to find his son. That is either the most generous thing anyone in this franchise has ever said, or it is the clearest evidence that these figures are entirely Dexter's invention, since the real Dokes would not have offered him a glass of water. There is a theory about how all of this ends, and it is the quietest one in circulation. It suggests the franchise closes inside the room rather than outside it. Not a courtroom, not a table, not a gunshot, but a final scene in which the voices go silent and Dexter is alone with himself for the first time since he was a small boy in a shipping container. Supporters argue that this is the only ending the show has not tried, that it fits a story which has always been about a man narrating his own life to keep from feeling it, and that a character who has spent 20 years talking to the dead would find genuine silence more frightening than any consequence a court could hand him. There is also a quiet argument about whether the room has a limit. For most of the franchise, it held one figure at a time, and the handovers were slow and marked. The new series put 4 people in it inside a single episode, and then swapped the occupant of the main chair during the finale. Viewers tracking that pattern have suggested the room is getting crowded, rather than simply changing tenants, and that a mind hosting this many voices is running out of space for the person who owns it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every one of these theories is really asking the same question underneath. This story has been given 3 endings already, and the audience rejected 2 of them outright, which means somewhere ahead there is a 4th, and the people who study this show have very strong opinions about what it has to be. Section 10. The ending everyone is bracing for. This story has been given 3 endings. The first put Dexter on a boat in a hurricane, and then in a cabin in Oregon with a beard, and it is regularly named one of the worst finales in television history. The second put a rifle round through his chest in the snow, and was defended by the people who made it as final, honest, and deserved. The third has not happened yet, and every theory in this video is really an argument about what it has to be. The most important piece of information available is that a plan exists. When the new series was being put together, the showrunner pitched Michael C. Hall on 3 seasons rather than 1, and that number has been repeated since. The second season has been confirmed with 10 episodes and an autumn release, which means whatever the plan is, roughly a third of it is still ahead. The second important piece is much older, and it is the reason the trial theory dominates every discussion about the ending. Clyde Phillips left the original series after its 4th season, long before The Boat and the Lumberjack, and he has said for years that his version of the finale would have put Dexter on death row, facing execution, forced to reckon with everything he had done. That was never made. Then he came back, wrote the New Blood ending, killed the character, and later admitted the reaction told him it had not landed the way he wanted. Now he is running a 3rd continuation with a multi-season plan and an idea he has been carrying for more than a decade that he has never been allowed to use. The theory practically writes itself, and it is the only ending this franchise has publicly wanted and never delivered. Dexter Morgan gets caught, and the story finishes in a courtroom rather than a field. What makes it more than wishful thinking is how carefully the first season stacked the pieces. Angel Batista, a retired detective from Miami Metro, was murdered in a New York vault, and the man officially responsible vanished the same night and has never been found. Detective Claudette Wallace has that case, and she also has a room full of files that Prater kept on every killer he ever hosted, including material that points to a woman being murdered in police custody. Wallace was personally warned by Batista in advance that a man in her city was the Bay Harbor Butcher, and she did not act on it in time. Joey Quinn is a lieutenant in Miami and once buried his own suspicions about the same man. Angela Bishop is alive in upstate New York with a complete account of Iron Lake. Lumen Pierce is alive somewhere with a complete account of everything else. And in the 2nd season, Dexter's son is joining the New York Police Department, which puts a young man with a body in his past inside the building where all of those threads are being pulled together. None of that describes a man who has escaped. It describes a man standing in the middle of the largest collection of loose threads the franchise has ever assembled, and the theory holds that the 2nd season pulls on them while the 3rd one snaps them. There is a strong counter-argument, and it comes from arithmetic rather than sentiment. This show is now the most successful thing the franchise has produced in a decade. The first season drew millions of viewers, scored higher with critics than almost any season in the show's history, and prompted the studio to cancel the prequel series that had already been renewed so it could concentrate everything on the version with Michael C. Hall in the lead. Successful shows do not end on schedule. They end when the audience leaves, and this audience has not left. A courtroom finale is a beautiful idea for a series that is finishing. It is a much harder sell for one that is making money. The second most popular ending theory removes the courtroom entirely and hands the job back to Harrison. The argument is that the show has already staged this once, in a field outside Iron Lake, and got it wrong by making it a mercy. Dexter asked to be shot. He arranged it. He talked his son into it, and he framed the whole thing as a sacrifice, which let him die as a father rather than as a murderer. The theory says the real version has to be the opposite. Harrison making the decision himself, without permission, because he finally understands what his father is and what his father has been doing to him. The showrunners' promise that Harrison will never be killed off strengthens this considerably. If the son is guaranteed to outlive the story, then the last thing standing at the end of the franchise is a Morgan, and the only question is which kind. A young man who breaks the chain, or a young detective in New York, with a room in his head and a voice in it that sounds like his father. A third theory says the ending is a killer, and specifically the one already cast. The man who terrorized New York and then stopped, who now spends his time calling the people he ruined, is exactly the kind of opponent this show has never used. Every major villain Dexter has faced was active. Trinity was killing. Brian was killing. The Doomsday Killer, the Skinner, Prater's entire circle, all of them were in motion, which meant Dexter could hunt them the way he hunts everybody. A man who has already stopped cannot be hunted the same way, because there is no next victim to intercept and no pattern to get ahead of. He has nothing left to take away, except the people around Dexter, and he has spent 20 years perfecting the art of reaching people by telephone. The version of this theory with the most support says the Ripper never touches Dexter physically. He does not need to. He works out who Dexter loves, and then he calls them. The fourth theory is the least dramatic, and, for that reason, the one a certain kind of viewer finds most convincing. It says, nothing catches Dexter Morgan at all. Not the police, not his son, not another killer. What catches him is time. The second season's own official description names his greatest enemy, and the answer it gives is a midlife crisis. A man in his 50s who has been carrying bodies since his 20s, with a head injury, a body that has been shot through the chest, and a job that requires physical strength and perfect nerves. Under this theory, the franchise ends with a man who simply cannot do it anymore, who watches his son take over the work, and who has to live inside a life he has never once had to occupy without the killing to organize it. The immediate future is at least partly visible. The second season brings back Charlie, brings in the Ripper, and adds a killer called the Five-Borough Killer, who threatens ordinary people by phone and then follows through, along with a third figure the production has barely described. There is a horror veteran cast in a role nobody has been told anything about. Al Walker is still out there in Wisconsin, with a wife and 4 children, and a file with his name on it in Dexter's bag. Claudette Wallace has a murder with a missing suspect. Harrison has a uniform, and a folder that Dexter chose to leave behind on a shelf has grown into the most dangerous thing in the city. What all of these theories have in common works less like a prediction and more like a demand. This audience has been handed an ending twice, and told twice that it was final, and both times the story reopened, once because the writers wanted a second chance, and once because the numbers were too good to leave alone. Every theory in circulation, from the coma argument to the courtroom to the son with the badge, is an attempt to work out what an ending would have to look like for it to actually stay closed. The show itself seems to know. Arthur Mitchell said it in the very first minutes of the new series, before Dexter had opened his eyes, and it is the only statement anyone has made about this character's future that has proven accurate every single time. Hell comes first, then resurrection. The trouble with a story built on that idea is that it never explains how many times the cycle is allowed to run, and after 19 years, 4 series, and 2 deaths, that were supposed to be permanent, nobody watching is willing to assume this one is the last. There is a structural version of the endgame theory that tries to predict the shape rather than the outcome, and it splits the remaining story cleanly in two. The second season is the season where everything closes in, and the third is the season where it lands. Supporters point to how the first season was built, with a slow assembly of threats that all arrived at once in the final 2 episodes, and argue the writers are running the same design across a longer span. Under that model, the second season ends with Dexter exposed to somebody who cannot be killed, bribed, or misdirected, and the third opens with him already caught in a way he cannot engineer his way out of. An older theory that predates the new series deserves a mention here because it refuses to die. Before anyone knew what the show would be, a widely shared idea suggested that Dexter would return already in custody, with the series set largely inside a prison and built around criminal psychologists interviewing him. It never happened, and the show went in a completely different direction. But the appeal of it explains a lot about why the courtroom theory has such staying power. A large part of this audience does not want Dexter to escape again. They want the story to finally sit still long enough to ask what he actually is. And a cell is the only setting where that conversation cannot be interrupted by another kill. The cancellation of the prequel series is treated as evidence by almost everybody. That show was renewed, then quietly shelved, then confirmed dead, and reporting at the time indicated the studio wanted to concentrate on the version of the franchise with Michael C. Hall in the lead. Fans read that as a decision to stop expanding and start finishing. A franchise that is spreading outward, adding prequels and spin-offs, is a franchise planning to run indefinitely. A franchise cutting everything back to one show and one actor is a franchise heading toward a conclusion, whether that conclusion arrives in the 3rd season or the 5th. There is one more idea circulating, and it is the bleakest of the lot. It notes that Dexter offered Leon Prater a specific kind of death, strapped to a table, told exactly what he had done and why it was ending, with no possibility of talking his way out. That is what Dexter does to people who deserve it, and he has been doing it for 20 years, while carefully avoiding the obvious question about himself. The theory holds that the ending has to involve Dexter Morgan on his own table, whoever puts him there, because that is the only conclusion this show has been building since its very first episode, and the only one that satisfies the rule he wrote his life around. Something else worth weighing is that the people making this show have now been publicly wrong about the ending twice, and they have said so. The finale of the original series was disowned by the network itself, with an executive admitting the show had not done the character justice. The New Blood ending was defended hard, then walked back once the reaction came in, and the man who wrote it acknowledged that it had not stuck the landing the way he intended. That history has made a section of the audience suspicious of any statement about finality, including the ones being made now. Every promise that this version has a plan is being weighed against 2 previous promises that turned out to be temporary. The wildest theory in the endgame pile barely qualifies as a theory at all, and it comes from people who have simply stopped believing this show can end. It suggests the franchise has become the thing it is about, a story with an appetite of its own that keeps finding new doors after every attempt to close it, and that the title of the current series is the writers admitting it out loud. 2 supposedly final deaths, a prequel, a sequel to the sequel, and a lead who was killed on screen and is now working in New York with a multi-season plan behind him. Under that reading, the honest answer to how it ends is that it does not, and that every theory in circulation is really an argument about how long the audience is willing to keep watching a man refuse to stay dead. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.